make sure we actually have a recording. I'll start a recording as well in case the stream doesn't work. So I think we're live on wherever we can be live. Today we have Daniel Hutmacher. Doesn't sound Swedish, but he's at least living in Sweden since many years. And Daniel is going to talk about cryptography. This is SQL Friday number 147. Yeah, I'm not going to say much more about that, but glad to have you here, glad to have you back. Daniel is the co-host of SQL Friday, which means more or less when I'm traveling, Daniel steps in from time to time to do the moderation and so on.
Unless you find like someone's bedroom to hide yourself in. It's not a burden exactly.
I have done it from I have been sitting in my own bed once because I didn't have this room and I wasn't able to go to my office to do the streams. But now I make things too complicated for myself by live streaming to YouTube, etc. So it's harder to just give it to someone else to do it. Which is also the reason why I don't create a schedule for a season. Instead, I announced it a couple of days beforehand because I don't really know what I will do the next week right now. And it's getting, since I complicate things for myself, I make it harder for anyone else to just step in and help me.
It's just human nature to make things more difficult once you start mastering them. I think that's...
Yeah, we probably get bored by doing same old.
Yes.
For me, there is a benefit, of course, to live streaming as well. That means what you see is what you get, and I don't have to spend hours editing the videos afterwards. And it also means that people don't have to wait 4 months to get the videos out, because that's the time frame I've had in the past, and that's why I started live streaming in the first place. Anyway, enough about me and my ways of complicating my life. Welcome, Daniel. Let's talk about encryption petitions or whatever.
Encryptotions. That's what happens when you have a large language model generate your entire presentation.
Will you just have like an audio translation of ChatGPT doing the presentation for you as well?
Yes, I am absolutely human. You can trust me.
Good. Welcome, bot.
Thank you for having me. I just told you off stream that it's always a pleasure to speak on SQL Friday, even though I think most online conferences really aren't for me, and that's purely subjective. It's not a judgment on online conferences. I just don't get the reward speaking on online conferences as much as I do in person. But SQL Friday is different because it's very familiar, it's very friendly, and I just enjoy my time here. So I'm here to talk about cryptography, which is one of those things that fascinate me, but I don't know a lot about it. So the solution was to basically make an introductory session and to do tons and tons and tons of research. I've spent more than 100 hours on the slides alone. So this is one of my most elaborate presentations ever. Still, this, like, cryptography is huge. People have been doing it forever because we like our secrets and we like to keep our secrets. And so it would be nigh on impossible, not just from a time constraint, but also from a knowledge perspective, for me to give you more than just a rough introduction. But the outcome of this session is to give you an idea of what goes on beneath the surface when you choose to check or not check the trust certificate checkbox, and how all of this stuff happens when you just transparently browse the web, connect to your database server, or whatever you do in your spare time. So my name is Daniel. I have a Swiss last name and I live in Sweden. I have kind of a split mind of how to identify myself as to nationality. I have two passports, so it all works out in the end. I've been doing SQL Server for a quarter of a century by now. For some reason, Microsoft saw fit to make me a data platform MVP, which I'm very, very happy for. I am the proprietor of my own consulting business. I run Data Saturday Stockholm, and everything else is in the slide. Do feel free to hit me up on Blue Sky or check out my blog. And before we go any further, just please interrupt me at any point. Put your questions in chat or just come off mute because if there's something I'm not explaining very well, and you think about that for the next 55 minutes instead of focusing on the presentation, you will be completely and utterly lost because everything builds upon the previous thing. So please just interrupt me with questions anytime something is confusing. I will probably draw over time here. I'm sorry, Magnus, if you have a meeting at 1 p.m.
No, it's okay. I never plan anything for 1 sharp because things happen.
We're gonna have some fun.
I agree. Just come off mute and talk if you have a question or raise your hand. But I'll ask Daniel if you can repeat the question afterwards because I only pick up you and me on the live stream to YouTube. So it'll get lost on them if you don't.
We'll do that. Awesome. So this is the simplest type of substitution cryptography. This is something your 4-year-old can pick up as soon as they know the alphabet. Essentially, what one of the Caesars figured out to just keep their secrets was that they could just shift the alphabet by one step. So if you want to encrypt the letter G, it becomes an H. If you want to encrypt the letter H, it becomes an I, and so on. So if you look at it at the surface, at the bottom line, the ciphertext looks nothing like the plain text. Just looking at it, you wouldn't know what it is. Obviously, this is super easy to crack. Super easy to crack. Again, your 4-year-old could crack this encryption. So a couple of 100 years later, what they came up with was, well, what if we have a key? What if we don't just shift the alphabet, but we actually have a key to encrypt things with? And so we could substitute a character, any given character, for a certain matching other character in that key set. And now we have what is more regularly known as a substitution encryption. And you can see on the screen how that works. So if you look up the character W here on the top row, the plain text, it translates to an S, which goes here. And you look up the the E, which translates to an O. And then when you want to translate that back, if you want to decrypt it, you need the key so that you can look up what the S matches and it goes back to the W and so on and so on. So again, this is a very, very, very primitive type of encryption. I will show you why it's not a good idea to do this. And the way to break substitution encryption is called frequency analysis. Now, if you look at any given language, letters appear in a large enough corpus of text. Letters appear in a rather predictable frequency. In most languages, the letter E is the most common letter that you will find in the alphabet. In English, the most common letters are E, A, N, I, and so on. And you can see by their percentages how common they are. You can basically take any Wikipedia article, any book or whatever, and just count the occurrence of every character in the alphabet and write it down in a table. So let's assume we know the language of the plain text and that we have enough plain text to draw some type of conclusion. Now let's analyze this ciphertext that we have on the right-hand side. And we count the number of occurrences for every character. How often does every character occur? As a percentage of the number of characters in the entire text. And we'll put that in the left column as you see. We can see that the character A appears 0.5% of the times, whereas if this were plain text, the character A would appear 8.2% of the times. What happens if we sort the left-hand column by percent and the right-hand column by percent? So now we've ordered both of these columns, the ciphertext and the English plain text, by frequency. And now you can see that a pattern emerges, right? The most commonly used character has roughly the same frequency occurrence in the ciphertext as it does in the English language. And the second one is also almost the same. The third, very similar as well. Can we draw conclusions from this? Yes. So let's just try substituting all of the ciphertext V's for English E's, ciphertext G's for English T's, and so on. Let's see where that leads us. That's pretty close, right? We're starting to see patterns here. It's not perfect because no text is going to be statistically perfectly distributed across the frequencies of every character. So from here on, we're going to have to find patterns, right? So if we see Gano, or we can tell that sometimes it has a couple of characters switched around, and then we can manually substitute those characters until we come up with something that makes more sense. And that's essentially how frequency analysis works. And if you thought this was science, just consider the fact that an ancient Arabic mathematician slash scientist slash multi-scientist, as they all were back in the day, way back in the, I think, 800s, figured this out, right? So this substitution encryption was cracked more than 1,000 years ago. So just don't use it today. You can make frequency analysis harder by introducing other things that negate frequency analysis. You can, for instance, have a key that maps one plain text characters to multiple ciphertext characters, stuff like that. It's still not a safe encryption scheme. So this is just for your background information. And now for a little bit of history. You will see a trend here that the art is generated by AI. So during the First World War, the German U-boats were patrolling the Atlantic Ocean, and they had a goal of not letting any supplies cross the Atlantic to reinforce the Allied forces in Europe, which was, you know, the easiest way to accomplish that is just sinking everything that looks like a freighter ship. But to really, really well identify what is a military transport vessel as opposed to just a passenger liner, you would have to bring the submarine to the surface. And this was especially true back in the First and Second World War, where they would occasionally repurpose civilian ships by just adding guns to them. And there are histories of civilian cruise liners having literally hidden guns during the Second World War. So the challenge for the German U-boat fleet was that they had to surface to inspect their targets, and they would be very, very vulnerable to counterfire. And so at some point, the Germans just stopped doing that. And they started shooting at basically everything that moved. And this led to the unfortunate sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania, which was a US ship. And the United States was neutral in World War One, and that was a problem. So you can't just go sinking passenger liners of neutral countries, and you don't really want to get into a fight with the United States. So Germany essentially said, "My bad. We're gonna stop just shooting at everything." What was known as unrestricted submarine warfare, and we're gonna just be very, very careful what we shoot at. But they really didn't want to bring the United States into the war. Um, but it didn't go so well for Germany, as you all know, because you know history. And at some point in 1916, Germany, the the German Foreign Secretary hatched a plan because they wanted to resume unrestricted submarine warfare because this was not working out, and Germany was losing the war in a lot of senses. Um, but they wanted also to make sure that the United States stayed out of the European war. And so Arthur Zimmermann, who was the German Foreign Secretary, he hatched a plan where he would secretly ask the Mexican government to invade the south of the United States to, in their view, reclaim, I think it was New Mexico and Texas and possibly California, but my history fails me here. Because Mexico had recently fought a war with the United States and lost those territories to the US. And so having Mexico engage in a war with the US would be a great way to keep the US out of Europe, essentially. So Zimmermann sent a coded message to the Mexicans, basically suggesting this. He sent the message to the German embassy in Mexico City, but because one of the very, very first things that happened was that basically on the first day of World War One, the British dug off the cables leaving Germany, so they couldn't use the undersea telegraph cables that were under the Atlantic Ocean. They had to use radio communication, and you can see how this would necessitate the use of strong encryption. Except Germany wasn't at that point very good at doing encryption stuff. They were kind of lackadaisical about it. This was what you can see on the screen was the actual telegram that they sent using telegraphy, whatever, a telegraph. But because of the limited range of the transmissions, they had to relay it across a number of places, I believe through the German embassy in Stockholm and then over the Atlantic to the German embassy in Washington, D.C., and then from there on down to Mexico City. All of it encrypted, of course. So what happened was that the British, who were really, really well into cryptography already at that point, they could actually decipher this message. And they could tell the US government about it. And here's a thing that you will learn from anything involved in cryptography. If you can decrypt your opponent's messages and they understand that, they will change the cryptography. So you will lose the ability to read their messages. So the last thing you want them to know is that you've cracked their codes. So what they actually did was they made it seem like the Mexican embassy, the German embassy in Mexico, or actually the Mexicans had leaked the message. So Germany was none the wiser, and they did not understand for years that the message had actually been intercepted by British intelligence rather than, as they thought, leaked by the Mexicans. Either way, this message made it into the public. It made big headlines. The German government had to publicly admit to sending the message and actually acknowledge that it was real. And this whole thing swayed the public opinion in the United States, which led to the United States entering World War I. So much of the outcome of World War I can actually be attributed to this encrypted message being intercepted and decoded by the British. And that gives you an indication of the importance of strong cryptography in wartime, in the interaction between states, but also for anyone who actually has secrets. So jump forward 30 years, I guess. The Germans had 25 years. The Germans had actually learned their lessons. They had built a much, much better encryption device called the Enigma. The Enigma was essentially a substitution encryption, but it had multiple steps and multiple complications to make it really hard to crack. They had, and what was revolutionary for this device, it was what we in IT would call an appliance. You could basically just dial in the code of the day, and you could use a keyboard to type in your plain text, and out would come the ciphertext. And you could also type in the ciphertext, and out would come the plain text. So this was, to my knowledge, the first real cryptographic appliance, and it was really secure. The British were working on trying to crack this for years, and they actually did in 1940 something, I believe. But again, when you've cracked something, when you can suddenly read all of your opponent's messages, you don't want your opponent or anyone else in the world to know that, so you keep it a secret, because for that period of time, from the point where you crack the cipher until everyone knows that you've cracked the cipher, that is your time to shine. That is when you can read all of the messages and know what the opponent is up to without them having that understanding. So the fact that the Enigma was cracked was not public until 1974, 30 years after the end of World War II. That's how long they kept it secret. The people who worked at Bletchley Park in the UK on cracking this thing, they were forced to destroy all of the machines, burn all of the notes, everything, all of the work that they had done just to keep this discovery secret, which was kind of amazing if you think of how we IT people just hoard all of our cool code snippets. Like, I'm going to save this for later because I might do this again. Not if you're into military intelligence or cracking encryption. So after World War II was the time when we started inventing computers to do all that stuff that we had humans doing, like hand calculations and cables and lights and lamps. All of that stuff was being digitized. So that allowed us, to make much, much more effective and large-scale encryption algorithms. I'm just going to speed through this, but from the time after the Enigma to what we have today, a lot has happened in cryptography. The big thing that came out was so-called block ciphers. Block ciphers are essentially a form of substitution encryption, but they encrypt, instead of individual characters, a block cipher takes, as the name implies, a block of text and encrypts the entire block. And then, yeah. In 1973, there was the DES algorithm, and those of you who are 40 or 50 years old or older, you will remember that DES, or triple DES as it was known at some point, was some kind of standard, albeit already at the time not very secure. So DES was actually made deliberately weak by the United States so that they could brute force it if they had to. This is what a modern block cipher works like. It consists of a number of so-called substitution boxes. These are mathematical operations or code routines or whatever you want. And you can put those in a series. So every S box or substitution box performs a mathematical transformation of your ciphertext or plain text. And you can chain these together, and you can run this whole chain for a number of rounds. And the more rounds you run it through, the more secure it becomes, because it takes much, much more time to brute force it. And brute forcing a cryptography basically means just trying all of the passwords. Now, if you imagine if encrypting a message takes 1 millisecond, and decrypting the message takes 1 millisecond. If you have to try 1,000 passwords, it's going to be 1 second. If you try 1,000,000 passwords, it's going to be 20 minutes. If you try 1,000,000,000,000 passwords, it's going to be a long time. So essentially what these substitution boxes, chaining them and adding rounds to them, makes you do if you're trying to brute force something is just making this trial and error brute force process take so much time that it is mathematically infeasible. So let's look at AES, which is the de facto standard in civil and military communication in the West, essentially. If you have a flash drive that encrypts your data, if you're running on-disk encryption for your computer, if you're running BitLock or whatever, chances are it's going to be AES 256. So suppose we have a plain text and a password. The plain text and the password, will translate those into hexadecimal values just to have something to work with using just a regular ASCII table. We'll put the plain text into what's called a data frame. A data frame is 16 bytes at a time. Remember when I said block ciphers encrypt blocks at a time? This data frame is one of those blocks. Now we'll do the same thing with the key, but the thing is we'll use what's known as a key expansion to take the key and generate it into a long series of keys. And the number of keys we need depends on the number of rounds for our encryption. So for AES 256, we'll need 14 round keys as they're known. And here you see the S boxes at the bottom left. And the first S box that we're going to do is called add round key, which is essentially just an XOR of the key and the data frame. And fun fact, if you're encrypting something in SQL Server, this is exactly how SQL Server encrypts the stored procedure or the view or whatever. It just XORs it, which makes it really, really easy to crack. So XORing means that you take a value, you break it into its binary ones and zeros, and for those places where the top and the bottom value are not equal, that generates a 1. Where they are equal, they generate a 0. And the funny thing with this is it's reversible. You can go from top to bottom, or you can go from bottom to top. And that's the beauty of XOR. I'm not going to even call it encryption, actually. It's just an XOR substitution. So now we've done the first substitution box. The second substitution box applies this something. It's just a hard-coded table that some people with really, really thick glasses have figured out. This table is the same for all AES encryption anytime, anywhere in the world. It's a static table. It's known. And it's designed in a way to make cryptography or decryption very, very, very hard if you don't know the key. Then we're going to shift the data frame around in a way. Also, the point of this is to make the decryption very, very hard for an opponent. And then we're going to apply some matrix math, which is so far above my pay grade. I won't even go into it because I know nothing about mathematics. I don't even have a high school degree. So essentially, these are the 4 substitution boxes that AES uses, and we're going to repeat these for every round key 10, 12, or 14 times, depending on the key length. Now, AES is algorithmically super fast. It is like your average Intel gaming processor will do 10, 15 gigabytes per second of AES encryption. So you can use it for full disk encryption. You can use it to encrypt memory. You can use it for basically anything. It is super efficient, and it's been around for, I believe, 20 years now. So it is really a de facto standard, and I believe in the US it's allowed for up to top secret classification. So if that's anything to go by, it's probably pretty safe. You will see this absolutely everywhere in all all kinds of technical and electronic applications. Now, I've mentioned encryption, but I also need to mention hashing. Hashing is something different from encryption. If you think of encryption, you can generate from ciphertext an encrypted text, and then you can take that encrypted text and combine it with the encryption key and go back to the plain text, which is great for sending messages to people. Hashing is not that. Hashing is not encryption. If you hash a value, it generates a checksum of the value. And that checksum cannot be used to regenerate the original plain text, but it can be used to prove that only this plain text asterisk could be used to generate the hash. So the hash is not reversible, whereas encryption is reversible. In rare cases, you will get what's called a hash collision, where two different values could generate the same hash key. So it's not a perfect solution if you want something like a unique key in a database context. Encryption uses a key or a password. Hashing does not. However, hashing can use a salt, which we'll get into. And the length of the ciphertext in an encryption will almost always be very similar to the length of the plain text that you're encrypting, which makes sense. If you're encrypting a certain amount of information and you want to be able to restore that information, you cannot lose information unless you apply some kind of compression algorithm or whatever. Whereas hashing generates a unique fixed width so-called digest. So depending on your hash algorithm, that the digest will always be the exact same number of bits. So where do we use hashing? Suppose you run a website and you allow users to create accounts with passwords. Now you don't want to store plain text passwords on that site. What you want to do is you want to store just the hashes of those passwords, because if someone runs off with your database, you don't want them to have 10,000 people's passwords, or you will end up in have I been pwned and have a really, really bad day. So the way that you do this is you hash the password, store it to disk, and when the user logs in, you take the user's password that they provide, you hash that the same way, and you compare the hashes to see if the user has entered the correct password. Whereas you don't know the password during all of this process. You don't store the password in your database. What security people have figured out is that you could take some commonly occurring passwords and just generate hashes for all of those passwords and put them all in a huge database, also known as a rainbow table. The rainbow table is called that because it contains the entire spectrum of all potential passwords, commonly guessable passwords, I guess, and their corresponding hashes. So you can just look up a hash and see what passwords would generate that hash. So this is a problem, especially with weaker hash algorithms, because if you have access to a rainbow table like that, you could reverse engineer the password given a hash digest. And the solution to this is using what's known as a salt. Now, again, if you have a user database on your user table on your database server and you have a password column, you would also add what's called a salt. So salt is a different column where you would have like a short value that is known. In this case, we'll just call it XYZ. And then when you hash XYZ, which is the salt, and your password, you get a completely different hash. And what this does is, suppose your hash is just 4 bytes. 4 bytes will generate something on the order of 2 billion combinations for every given password. You have 4 billion different types of hashes, depending on what salt you're using. And the salt can be rotated and updated frequently. And now a rainbow table won't work to reverse engineer the password. So you can just change the salt any day and you will get a completely different hash. I'm judging by the lack of questions that you're all having lunch and following along nicely. So again, just interrupt me if any of this just doesn't make sense.
We're good. We're good.
We're good. Also, so hashes, what are they used for? They're used for passwords, like I just showed you, but they're also used, you can hash entire documents, you can hash an entire folder on your computer because it always generates a string that is fixed width. So when you commit something to Git, you get a SHA-256, I think, hash. So that is a hash of the code that you've committed. You can hash two different documents and then see if the hash matches. Those two documents are the same. You can also use it for digital signatures, which we're going to get into really soon. Because from here on, it gets more mathematical. It gets way more mathematical. But don't run away. It's basically ninth grade math if you squint a little. So what we've looked at so far is with AES is called symmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption means you have to give someone, like the encryption text needs an encryption key in order to be able to decrypt it. So if you're sending a message to someone, you also have to secretly give them an encryption key. And that's a problem because if I want to email Magnus a secret over the internet, how do I get him the encryption key? Do I tell him do I tell him something like, remember that place where we had that sushi? Remember the name of that place, the four first characters of that place, and the last four digits of my social security number and something, something. It's not a great way to convey your secrets. So if we go back to the Enigma machines, for instance, the Germans would have code books that were on every submarine, on every ship, on every military frontline unit. And that's essentially how they also, one of those code books came into the possession of the Brits. And that was partly how the Brits were able to crack the Enigma machine. So you have to distribute all of these secret keys. That's symmetric encryption. Asymmetric encryption relies on something called public key or public and private keys. And it takes away the need for a secret key that you send to someone. You can keep your secret key, called the private key, and never show it to anyone else but yourself. And you can still send a message to someone else so that they can read it and only they can read it. There are two different asymmetric encryption, RSA and elliptic curve encryption. I just don't understand elliptic curve encryption. It is slightly more modern, but they work on the same basic principles, which I will get into. But for this presentation, we're going to look at RSA encryption. So suppose that the sender on the left has a plain text message and the recipient on the right-hand side has generated a pair of keys, public and private. What happens is the recipient will send or post on the web or nail to a door or whatever their public key and say, hello world, this is my public key. It's not secret. Anyone can use this public key to send me information. How does that work, you wonder? Because the sender can plug that public key into an encryption function along with the plain text and get a ciphertext that they can send to the recipient. And the beauty of this is the recipient needs only the private key to be able to decipher the ciphertext. If you don't have the private key, which is mathematically matched to the public key, so those go hand in hand and share a bunch of properties, you can't derive the plain text. This way, no key has changed, no private key has changed hands in this entire interaction. The function is a one-way function in mathematics. So it's essentially a function that is not easily reversible. And I'm going to show you what that means, but we're going to have, oh, I'm going to show you what that means in this example. So there was an Australian scientist called William Stanley Jevons who published what he would call, what was to be called Jevons number. And he said in one of his books, can the reader really say what two numbers multiplied together will produce the number 8,616,460,799? Think about that for a second. If you just look at this number, how would you find, without a computer, because this was in the 1800s, how would you, without a computer, find which two numbers, large numbers, you would have to multiply together to come to this number? It's very easy to multiply those two numbers with just pen and paper, but reverse engineering this into two numbers that you can multiply, two integer numbers that you can multiply to get this number is a very, very hard mathematical challenge. And this is the fundamental of public key encryption. You have a one-way function. It's very easy to multiply two numbers. It's very hard to factor those numbers, as it's called. Factoring is the process of breaking a number into two multiplying numbers. To understand some of what we're going to go through, I'm going to tell you about the modulo. So modulo is a mathematical operation where you basically calculate the remainder of a given base. So for modulo 10, you can just take the last number, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 modulo 10 is 5 because that's the rightmost number because we use 10 as our number base. But it also works for all other number bases. If you think about it, the modulo 7 of a number looks like this. It's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then it resets. So you have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it resets. Every time the number is evenly divisible by the base, or the modulo, the remainder resets. So it's 0, 1, 2, 5, and so on. So it works for modulo 7, modulo 8, modulo 9. Just remember this because it's going to be important for the rest. The other thing you need to know about is prime numbers. A prime number is a number that you cannot evenly divide by anything but itself and 1. So if you think about it, 1, 2, and 3 is not the factor of two other numbers where other than 1. The number 4, however, is 2 times 2. Number 6 is 2 times 3. But there are no two numbers you can multiply to reach 5 unless you use a 1. And so prime numbers work very particularly in mathematics, and so that's where we're very interested in finding just the prime numbers. With that information, let's just run through an example of RSA encryption. Suppose you generate two numbers, P and Q. Now, P and Q separately are private, confidential numbers. These numbers you keep for yourself, right? Because if you know these numbers, you can do all kinds of things. But if you multiply them together, you reach this number, which in this example is the equivalent of a 37-bit key size. This number, the factor of these two private numbers is public. You can give this to your friends, it's fine. Now from this, we do a bit of mathematical trickery. We find the least common multiple of these two P and Q, right? And essentially what we do is we go through a number series of mod P minus 1 and a number series of mod Q minus 1, and we find where they line up, right? Where they both are 0. I don't have the mathematical chops to explain why this is, but this is a trivial mathematical operation because there are algorithms out there that do this. You will need this number, 48 billion. And then from that, we choose a random integer, which must be coprime. Coprime means that it is, they don't share any other divisors other than 1. Again, this is just mathematics. You can see how this is easy to perform in the forward direction, if you will. Now, if you have this information, you have this lambda of PQ and E, you can calculate what's called D, which is a private key. And again, because only we know this information, because only we know the exact values of P and Q, only we can calculate what D means. So what we have now is we have a public key. If someone wants to send you a message, we can tell them, here's our E and here's our PQ. What you need to decrypt a message sent to you is the private key, which is D and PQ. And this is about as much math as it gets, so you don't have to stress out. Let's assume that we have a plain text message. This could be the ASCII value of a block of text. It could be large, it could be small. What we do with this plain text is that we raise it to the power of E. So E here is 65,000. We take this number, 1.2 million, and raise it to 65,537, which gives us this pretty large number once we've done modulo PQ. Remember modulo? We cut off the end and just save the remainder of the value. Now, people with very, very thick glasses have figured out that if you do this, you can take this encrypted, this ciphertext, plug it in here, raise it to the power of D, and modulo PQ, and out comes the plain text again. If this is mind-bending to you, it is to me as well. But I just think math is so beautiful and so amazing. I think we're going to run over time today, Magnus. I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries.
Yeah. So again, this part, going forward in this mathematical operation is super easy, barely an inconvenience. So there are mathematical functions that will do this, all of this stuff for you. Every time you surf the web, this happens in your browser. Going back, if you just have PQ and factoring out P and Q separately is very, very difficult. This is a super expensive operation. It requires a lot of computing power. Not necessarily factoring this one. This will probably run in a few milliseconds on your Pentium computers or your Xeon or your whatever. But in the numbers that we use in the real world, this is a super expensive operation. This, just going directly from PQ to this lambda function, is also super difficult. Because what we did, we know the P and Q values. This is very easy for us. But an attacker who only has the public key will find that this is very, very difficult. And so it's the mathematical theory here is that it's very hard for an attacker to understand what P and Q is, and they won't be able to calculate it. Now for some real world example. If you look at this is more like a 4096-bit RSA key. This is the actual size of a 4096-bit key. And can you figure out which two prime numbers you would have to multiply to reach this number? I didn't think so. So the thing is, yeah, I just asked Copilot actually, because I thought, how hard can it be? And if nothing else, let's see if we can just burn down a data center to see if it can figure it out, right? And it started thinking, and it thought for it for like 25, 30 seconds, and I was like, I think I'm onto something, or I'm going to get a call from Microsoft any second now. And lo and behold, it actually told me two prime numbers. So it said the two prime numbers that can be multiplied to form the given numbers are, and so on. And it sees what we're doing, right? Note that these are very large prime numbers and the multiplied. Prime numbers are numbers. Fundamentally number theory. They can have several applications in computer science, cryptography, and other fields. Except it's wrong, right? You get an F. Here's the correct answer. And I only know this because I actually computed this. It's not because I managed to factor 4096 bits. And if you did guess correctly, just pretend like you never did. Never tell anyone, because there's literally not an intelligence agency or a math professor, for that matter, who would not kill you for that information. Factoring a 4096-bit number is, to the best of our public knowledge, impossible, or just completely unfeasible at this point. For some reference, RSA has published a bunch of prime factors, and there's prize money if you manage to factor them. So if you have all the compute power in the world, you can actually try your hand at factoring these huge numbers. The largest one cracked so far was in 2020. It is equivalent of a 829-bit key. Most encryption today is in 2048-bit, and it's probably even recommended that you should go 4096-bit. For every bit you add, you double the number of computational power required to brute force something. So brute forcing something that is 830 bits will take twice as long as brute forcing something which is 829 bits. I'll put an asterisk on that because that's almost their algorithms. But anyway, the computational effort to crack this 800 and something bit key was roughly equivalent to 2,700 CPU core years. So yeah, do with that information what you want. Also, fun fact, the patent number for RSA, the algorithm that we just looked at, is actually prime. This is elliptic curve encryption, and it has to do with finding intersections in an elliptic curve. It's just, I have no idea what this is, but Heini Ilmarinen is actually a PhD in math, and she wrote her thesis on this stuff. So ask her if you want more information, because the Wikipedia article is not what I would call self-explanatory. Trust me on this one. So how is asymmetric encryption used? Asymmetric encryption is used for what's known as key exchange. As you can see by all of the math, it's absolutely not as fast as AES. AES, as I mentioned, can throughput tens of gigabytes per second on an average computer or a powerful consumer processor. RSA, absolutely not that powerful. So we use RSA for just small amounts of data, which is the key that you can then use for regular AES encryption or symmetric key. So we use asymmetric encryption for exchanging keys, for SSH, same thing. It's also used in blockchains and cryptocurrencies, and it's also used for cryptographically secure signatures. And we're going to look at that in the little time that we have left. So here's the big picture. Suppose we have a client, they're surfing the web, connecting to SQL Server or whatever happens that is encrypted. The client starts off saying, hello, and then just a random jumble. Well, hello, client. Here's my jumble of random characters and my public key. The server also delivers a certificate in this exchange, and we'll go into what that certificate is. So to understand certificates, we also need to understand cryptographical signatures. And you won't have to learn much new here, because signing in an RSA signature works exactly the same way as an RSA encryption. What you do is, if you look to the right here, remember that when we encrypt stuff, we take the plain text, raise it to the power of E modulo PQ, and then we get a ciphertext C, which we can raise to the power of the secret key modulo PQ, and we get the plain text out again. Signatures work very, very similarly. Suppose the signer does a hash of the message, and then they raise that digest to the secret key. And using the secret key here means that you prove that you are who you say you are, because no one else has your secret key, right? Modulo PQ. And that's the signature. Then we send that message, the signature, to the reader, who hashes the message also. The reader, who does not have your private key, can raise the signature that you sent them, the hash value, the signed hash value. It can raise that to your public key, which you've given them, modulo PQ, and they will get the digest out, right? So if you take the signature raised to the public key, modulo PQ, you will get the digest out. And if these two match, you know that it's a valid signature. This is just mathematical beauty to me. So here's a real world scenario of how we use certificates. Suppose you're connecting to a server. You say, hello, are you who I think you are? Server says, sure am. And here's my certificate along with my public key. Now the certificate gives you the public key and the signature of the public key. And so who's going to sign that, you ask? Well, a certifying authority, someone we trust, is going to sign that. But how do I know the certifying authority is who they claim they are? Well, they have signed whatever certificate they're delivering. That certificate was signed by a root CA. Now, the root CA is kind of the mother lode, the mother of all certifying authorities. And if you buy a new computer or install a new blank operating system on your computer, it already comes preloaded with a bunch of root CAs. I think you will find there maybe 50 or 100 or something. Those root CAs are just implicitly trusted because they come with your operating system. So the client can see that the server has a certificate that has been signed by the CA. The CA has a certificate that was signed by a root CA, and you trust the root CA, so you know that the server is who they say they are. Essentially, if someone shows you their driver's license, how do you know the driver's license is real? Well, you can tell by different ways that their driver's license is actually issued by a government that you implicitly trust. And that's how you know who you're talking to. Same thing with server certificates. After that, the client says, all right, we'll use your public key. The client encrypts their message with the server's public key, sends it to the server. So the certificate is a digital identity card so that you know you're speaking to the correct server and not just any hacker on the internet. Because because here's what could happen otherwise. Let's just say you speak to a random server on the internet. The server sends you their public key. You send them their ciphertext. But what if it's not the server that you're talking to? What if the attacker sends you the attacker's public key? You send the attacker the ciphertext, which the attacker can decipher, and then re-encrypt and send to the server using the server's private key, or public key. You would never know that you're sending information that the attacker can read, and the server would never know that they're actually not talking to you, and the attacker could read the whole communication. This is why we use certificates. This is what we've shown here is called a man-in-the-middle attack. And if you use a certificate, you can prevent man-in-the-middle attacks from happening. So because already in this first negotiation step, the attacker would serve you with the attacker's public key, along with the attacker's certificates, at which point you would be able to tell that the attacker is not the server that you think you're talking to. So whenever you check the trust certificate checkbox when you're connecting to a server, because you keep getting certificate errors because they're self-signed or whatever, when you check trust certificate, you're basically telling your client application to not verify that the certificate is accurate for the server you're speaking to. If you have a corporate laptop, chances are you're your employer has already installed a root certificate of their own, and that way they can actually man in the middle all of your traffic as part of their malware and virus scan detection system. So if you have no other takeaway from this session than this, remember that when you're browsing the web, your employer can read your traffic, even if you're surfing to HTTPS. Remember, they can read your email. Remember that if you're using Dropbox or whatever, they can see what's in there. They're probably not looking, but they have the technology. So going back to the big picture, the server has sent us a certificate. We've validated the certificate. Now we generate what's known as a pre-master secret, which is our secret, along with the server random and the client random that we got up here. We send all of that public key encrypted to the server. You can both now compute session keys from that information because you both have the same information. And now you can speak symmetric encryption between those two. So here are all the moving parts. We're almost at the end now. So the first thing that happens is you need to issue a certificate to a server. What you do is you take the server's public key, you hash that key, you take the hash raised to the power of the issuer's private key. Yeah, that's it. Modulo PQ. And this generates the signature, which you then add to the certificate. So that certificate contains the public key along with its hash and the signature of that public key and hash, so that the reader of the certificate can know that the certificate is authentic and hasn't been tampered with. Verifying the certificate, same thing. You take the public key and the issuer's public key, you hash the public key, and you can compare the digest in the certificate to the digest that you just got. You encrypt the session key, send asymmetric data, and yeah. So through and through all of this, the RSA method is you take the message raised to the key modulo PQ. And that is a reversible operation when you switch the public and the private keys around. So how do you beat strong encryption? This is impossible, right? We've proven basically, or I've told you that something like 4096-bit RSA cannot be cracked. And that is, to the best of my knowledge and to the best of the world's researchers' knowledge, a correct statement. But there are other ways to break encryption. So I love this XKCD cartoon. On the left, the attackers go like, his laptop's encrypted. Let's build $1 million cluster to crack it. No good. It's 4096-bit RSA. Blast! Our evil plan is foiled. Whereas what they would actually do would be rubber hose decryption. So they would basically tie you to a chair and make you tell them the password, right? And that tells you all you need to know about encryption security. There are so many vectors, so many places where you would attack encryption. That is not the actual encryption algorithm. All of these components that you see on the screen are involved in sending a message from a client to a server. So back in 2007, Microsoft researchers found a intentionally weakened or a backdoor in a random number generator. Random number generators are important because that's how you generate P and Q. And if you can always make it generate predictable P's and Q's, it's so much easier to crack. They found that NSA had introduced the intentional backdoor, and that algorithm has since long been deprecated and withdrawn. Who remembers EncroChat, the encrypted chat application that let's just say you wouldn't tell your mother if you're using it because you would probably be a criminal, because no one pays $20,000 to use a phone that is encrypted. You can do that for free. The French police just basically walked into a data center told the people working there, we were never here and you will give us the key to the server. And they installed their own software on the server to read the text. They didn't read the encrypted data. They read the data when it arrived on the server. So, you could do that. Um, a couple of law enforcement agencies all over the world, they banded together to create one of those criminal chat applications for criminals. And I'm not saying chat applications are criminal, but it was geared towards drug dealers and darknet people, whatever. And so they marketed this very, very skillfully to look like one of those encrypted chat applications, except they'd written it themselves and they were reading everything that people were saying. So this was basically a Trojan horse. I love this. I said, just how do you defend against this, right? Dutch CA was hacked in 2011. The attacker generated their own certificate for gmail.com so that they could basically man in the middle gmail.com and read 300,000 people's emails. And it is believed that these were Iranian users, so it was probably the Iranian government who did that. They are no longer in business, DigiNotar, I think. And this is my favorite. The government of Kazakhstan figured out that if everyone's using TLS or SSL to browse the web, we can't read their traffic, which is problematic for us as a controlling, overbearing government. So they tried to persuade browser manufacturers to include their own root certificate in the browser distributions. And obviously, browser manufacturers, as you do when the government of Kazakhstan contacts you to ask you to do shady shit, they said, no, we're not going to do that. And so basically after a couple of months or years of back and forth, the government of Kazakhstan just gave up with the browsers. And instead they emailed their users and said, you're going to have to install this certificate or you're not going on the internet. We'll put you in jail. But you can rest assured that there is no root CA from Kazakhstan installed on your browser because they just wouldn't do that. So you can see how you can attack all of these different surfaces in the chain to intercept traffic and be able to read stuff that you think is encrypted, even though you cannot attack the actual cryptography. So just a quick takeaway before you go. If you check trust server certificate when you're connecting to an application, understand that you could be man in the middle and you would never know about it because you're not validating the certificate. The error goes away, but you don't know who you're talking to, right? It could be a Raspberry Pi that someone plugged into the network socket somewhere in your office that is picking up your IP traffic, looking at it, maybe even transforming it, and then just sending it onto the server, and you would never be the wiser. And also understand that, cryptography is super, super complex. If you're still around and if you're still awake, hit me with questions. My presentation slides are on GitHub on the link on the screen. And thank you, Magnus, for having me, even though I went over by 8 minutes.
It's okay. It's okay, Daniel. I stole the first 4 minutes from you by speaking about myself or something.
I could basically talk cryptography until the sun goes down, which is not that late in Sweden this time of year.
We had a fun chat conversation here. Alexander was trying to download your slides, and since he was behind a VPN, he was the PDFs were corrupted with VPN on. So I guess
how does that work?
They probably don't want people to download shit from GitHub because they don't trust everyone who puts.
Oh, like a corporate VPN. Yeah. So, yeah, corporate firewalls are not very happy about GitHub and Dropbox and other places because, I mean, it's a perfect vector to get malware, right?
Yeah. And then,
but you can trust me, bro.
Speaking about the man in the middle for SQL Server, unless you have configured Kerberos correctly, the man in the middle can actually send your packet when changing it and sending it to the server and make it work. Uh,
Yeah, even that.
Whereas if to my understanding, if you have Kerberos working, that will not be possible. Because you set up the Kerberos configuration between entity A and entity B, and the man in the middle is C, and that's not true. Then the authentication will
Yeah.
not work. But it's it's hard, and the advice is to, if you're on you have a big company and you decide that, we don't need proper certificates in dev, for example, we just put it in prod. Everyone is going to check trust service certificate in management studio,
Yes.
so they will trust
Yes.
the production as well, and that opens up for a man in the middle. So be careful and be consistent. If you have certificates, put them everywhere. Don't just put them in prod.
Yes. And layer your security, right? So you need layers because people will circumvent one of those layers. You like if you check trust service certificate, you need other layers to catch those attack vectors and make sure that nothing bad happens.
And then I think let's take a random cloud provider. Let's say Microsoft, for example. They have a little cloud called Azure. Do I trust that they have good security measures? Yes. But do I trust that everyone in Microsoft is a trustworthy person? Well, probably not. So also a way to get security working is to not let any one person know enough secrets to crack these things. Because if I
Yes.
kidnap Daniel's wife, I could probably get him to tell me anything, and that goes for everyone. If
Why'd you have to involve my wife in this?
just go after
No, but
anyone's family,
that's
and
the
they
truth.
will give up any information you want from them.
Yeah.
So don't let one person know. Which is why I'm really against storing passwords in a secure location. Just don't store passwords.
Yeah.
If you need a password for a, I don't know, Windows service that is connecting to something, configure that service and then throw the password away. Only that service needs to know. You never need to know. If you need to set that password again, just generate a new password and use that instead. So
Yes.
the safest way is to never store anything that is a secret, basically.
I love it. That's exactly right. And also always be cognizant that there are always more attack vectors, and you need to enable a mindset of security in depth where you have different layers of security. For one, just make sure no one gets into your network. Second, make sure that you know who you're talking to on your network, that the data is encrypted, um, if possible. There are so many. I'm not a security professional, so don't go back to your CTO with stuff I said and say we need to do this. Except trust your do not trust your certificates. That's the one takeaway I want people to have from this session.
Hmm.
So
And and
understand that you're going unencrypted, or make sure you have proper certificates, but don't pretend that you have certificates because that will trick someone into trusting something.
yeah, and there are options now in SQL Server where you can use strict security, etc. Sounds good. No client supports it, or very few clients support it. So it isn't as easy as it sounds, but think
Mhm.
about it at least. So,
And also, one of the slides I've grayed out in this presentation has to do with traffic analysis. If everything you send, all of the gigabytes that you send over your network, all of the time, everything is encrypted, an attacker will have such a hard time finding which one of those communication channels to try to attack.
Yeah.
So if to use an analogy, if you have a paper shredder in your office, which I have, I love my paper shredder. It's a childish passion I have. If you only shred 2 documents per year and you dump that bucket into the paper collection um, bin in your house, someone who breaks into your garbage collection room can easily figure out which ones are the sensitive documents because it's those 2 pieces of papers that you've shredded.
Yeah.
Whereas if you shred everything, they have no way, like it's too much information for them to try to decipher everything.
Mm.
Um, like two papers, you can tape those together. It takes you like half an hour or something with like average tape to just do that. But you can't if you have a documentation of 100 pages and you just shred it instead. Same analogy for traffic analysis. If everything you do is encrypted, it's so much harder for an attacker to get to you. And that's essentially why everything on the web now is HTTPS. If you want to check what time does your subway leave this afternoon when you're going home from work? What's the bus schedule like? That's not confidential information unless you're mapping out someone's travel habits, I guess.
Mm.
But because that is HTTPS, an attacker will only see HTTPS whatever you're doing on the internet. If you're reading fan fiction or planning your trip home from work, or if you're just looking up the weather report, or if you're doing your banking transactions, if everything is encrypted, it's so much harder to try to decipher everything and determine what's what.
Yeah. And
So,
a few years ago there was this debate about the uh, FRA. I don't know what the English.
yeah, Swedish Signals Intelligence Agency.
Yeah, well, how they're intercepting all traffic leaving and entering our country, basically. Um, and that's all good. But even they won't be able to decipher everything if they have enough information, or they do. I don't know what kind of root certificates they have their hands on, but
No one knows. So the trend right now is in this context, as I understand it, and this applies to the NSA and probably FRA as well, is store now, decrypt later. They're basically just calculating on the fact that it will be more computationally feasible to decipher all of this stuff in a couple of years or a couple of decades.
mm,
The information will most likely be old, but by that time, like today, you could probably decipher triple DES in a matter of milliseconds. It's so easy to brute force triple DES.
mm,
So if you have a secret document that one embassy sent to another embassy in 1992, it's probably super easy to decrypt that now. It's been 20, 30 years, but this stuff gets old.
and
So
you mentioned if you create a stored procedure or a view or something, and you use the with encrypt option. Uh, how and you also mentioned it's not very secure, it's not really encryption, and it's actually so bad that if you install Redgate SQL prompt, which is a fantastic tool, and
oh
you
god.
start typing alter proc dbo dot beginning of your proc name, it will autocomplete. You hit enter, it'll get the text in plain text for you. You don't need to do anything else than installing SQL prompt, and yeah, there are
Which is
better ways to protect your code than use the with encrypt option.
that is impressive because I thought the only way to get the encrypted code nowadays is to have a dedicated administrator connection. Because otherwise those fields in the DMVs will be null. That is how I remember it. They introduced that in 2005, 2008, something.
It didn't work.
So back in SQL 2000, you could just get the encrypted text and just decrypt it. Now I think you need a dedicated administrator connection.
It might be that I have in this case you need the SA connection. Yeah, so it might be that I am sysadmin on the box where I do it, so then SQL prompt can open the DAC and get that information.
Mhm.
I'm not sure, but yeah.
But yeah. So the trick to deciphering for those still watching, the trick to deciphering SQL Server um, modules is if you have the DAC connection and you get the encrypted text, what you do is you save the encrypted text in a variable.
Mm.
Then you do alter procedure or alter view and replace it with a known plain text in a transaction. You begin transaction, alter view or procedure or whatever with a known text, and then check the DMV again, and then you see what the encrypted version of your known text is. Now you have the plain text, the known plain text, and the known ciphertext. You can compute the XOR key.
Okay.
And then you just roll back the transaction. And then you can apply that now known encryption key, or XOR key, to the encrypted text. That's basically how you decrypt it. It's on my blog, sequelsunday.com.
Oh, good plug. All right. I have a phone meeting that I need to call into, and I have a meeting with Daniel in 40 minutes as well.
Oh shit, that's right. I need to eat lunch.
Go and do that. Thanks for coming. I've seen this presentation before, but some of it still bends my brain a little bit.